of UV mapping. Yes, big gasp for effect there. UV mapping is definitely challenging if you don't have the steps. It's one of those things, you know, it's fairly simple in theory, pull the pen, throw the grenade, but you have to know the steps in order to execute it properly. Does that make sense? Because there's all kinds of bad things that can happen if you don't do something exactly right. UV mapping is kind of like that, in that there are some very specific steps that you have to take when you are UV mapping. And if you're missing one of them, you stop. You're spinning your wheels and you go nowhere. And it's not like something that will intuitively be figured out. You literally, if you don't have the steps, you're pretty much done. So in terms of the broad strokes of UV mapping, how does it work? What is it exactly? That stuff is pretty simple. You know, I try to explain it as simply as I can. But when we go into the steps, the technical order of operations, they must be followed to the letter. So when I say, and these are the steps for whatever, then you need to be writing that stuff down. If you have never taken notes in your life, do it today. I can't tell you how many students assume they're going to be okay with this and are not. And then it's like, whoa, what do you mean? One of my assignments week 4 is all UV mapping and a 13-14% of my grade. Yeah. So here's the thing. This is not something you're going to get a lot of information on the outside about. I'm not sure why it is, but not a lot of people teach UV mapping. I'm not really sure. I guess they assume we already get it, or I don't know. I'm not sure. But anyway, point being, you got to get this information from me, or you are most likely not going to get it. So make sure you're dialed in, because when it comes to UV mapping, this is something you're going to have to do for every model you build from this class forward. So UV mapping is a thing. It's not something you're going to get out of. If you are modeling in polygons, you will be UV mapping. So make sure you understand this material, because when you walk into model creation, they're going to have you UV mapping your models. When you go into character design and creation, you're going to be UV mapping your models. So this is a thing, and it's not going to go away. So you really need to understand it at its basic level, or you will struggle mightily with it as you go. Does that make sense? And again, I'm not trying to scare you. That's not my thing. I'm making you aware so that you can make smarter choices, because I don't want you to get surprised by this. You know what I mean? That's a landmine. Go around it. That's my style. So I'm going to point out the stuff that's dangerous. So point being, again, take notes, ask questions today. The smartest thing you could be doing is paying attention to me. The worst thing you could be doing is anything other than paying attention to me, because you will miss this information and this will be a problem. Does that make sense? Because I know there's a tendency to be like, oh, I could work on my assignments. It's 2 more hours. No, you can't do it. Because what happens is the 2 hours you gain in not listening to me and working on your assignments turns into 6 hours of crying because you don't understand what we talked about today. So this is a bad trade. Does that make sense? Okay. So again, you've been warned. I don't want to hear about it after this. I've let you know. Sign the paper in front of you and turn it in. No, I'm kidding. There's no paper. But you have been warned. Please heed my advice. All right, lecture 8, UV mapping. All right, vocabulary, UV mapping. UV mapping is basically the process of taking a complex curved surface and trying to lay it out flat for the purposes of adding textures, gesundheit, or additional modeling details. The UV mapping process, again, with polygons is a must. You've got to do it. If you're going to have textures on your geometry, if you are going to be gesundheit using normal maps or anything like that, you need to have your UVs laid out. And as I said, from here forward, you're going to be UV mapping everything you make. So you really need to understand this process. In addition to which, if you want to be a modeler, when you're all grown up and you have a job, and I really hope you get one, when you get that job, you're going to be UV mapping your models. That's not like somebody else's gig. If you are the modeler, you are also the one who does the UV mapping. And to be honest with you, in 90% of the cases, and maybe a little higher, if you are the modeler, you're also doing the texture work, which is actually very cool. I really enjoy the texturing process. It's a lot of fun. And if you like painting at all, any of you guys paint? Any painters? You like to do drawings in Photoshop or anything like that? Okay, if you love working in Photoshop, you like drawing and painting, that's a big chunk of texturing, which is a lot of fun, actually. I really enjoy it. So you'll like that when you get to it. Yes?
Where does the UV stand for? Or why is it called UV
It's named after Ulrich Vector, who is he was a German scientist who was responsible for determining coordinate space on the surface of a polygon object, as well as the first original patent on the whoopee cushion. No, I'm kidding. UV. You like that one? Yeah. Did you? You were going for it? Yeah. No. They call it UV. I'm not sure why they went with that. X, Y, and Z was taken in terms of coordinate space in the universe, and they had to come up with some way of talking about the surface of an object, so they just decided to do U and V, because I guess everything is from the tail end of the alphabet. I don't know. I'm not really sure. There's also like S and T in terms of surface space, so it gets really weird. But that's a good question, and if you find out what it is, tell me. I've not found out what that is, why they chose that. But again, X, Y, and Z, world space was taken, so U and V somehow ended up with as the name. But it's a fair question. And one I will probably research again just to see if somebody else has come up with an answer, because I don't like not knowing the answer. That bothers me. The whoopee cushion thing works, right? Good old Ulrich Vector. Oh, thank you. Thank you. So back onto our UV mapping. Again, it's not an overly complicated idea, but the execution is the hard part. And that's why I want to make sure you're dialed in for today, particularly when I go through the steps. But the reason we do this UV mapping is if you look at your model, I mean, it looks so much cooler with a texture on it. I mean, that's when it really takes that big leap towards being real, in my mind. I kind of get a little excited when I start the texturing process, because I know pretty soon it's going to look much more awesome. So for me, I really enjoy that aspect of the pipeline. And I think you will too once you get a chance. So what we need to do is understand what UV mapping is, again, on its broad strokes before we get into the finer technical points of UV mapping. Do you want to come in? Do you want to? No, okay. He just wants to watch. So what we're going to do is we're going to draw a parallel between the real world and the UV mapping world. Now, in terms of the real world, if you're trying to find a location, so let's say you want to come visit me and Brian in our summer home in Attu, Alaska, sit back on the porch and drink lemonade. I might tell you, hey, listen, if you want to come see me, we live on this island called Attu, and if you imagine the island looks like an elephant, if you go over the first wrinkle in the back of his neck, that's where our house is. Now, this is a kind of a problem because A, you have to be able to fly high enough to determine the appearance of the island, and B, that has to look like an elephant in order for you to find a location, right? Do you guys see the elephant? No, mostly it's a Rorschach test. But if I tell you C2, boom, you can find Earl Cove very easily, right? And what I've done is taken an ambiguous analog form or concept, and I've organized it, structured it in such a way that it makes the most sense to the broadest number of people. I see the elephant too. We are similar. But does that make sense? I'm using coordinate space to organize a surface to explain where it is. Make sense? Hell yeah? Okay, good. I'm organizing the surface of, in this case, an island using coordinate space. Okay, and the idea is mutual understanding, because that's what it helps me do, mutual understanding. Okay, now the difference here is mutual understanding between you and I, that's one thing. When we're UV mapping polygon geometry, we are creating a mutual understanding of surface between you and Maya. Does that make sense? You both have to understand what you're looking at. So that's why we have to organize, we have to structure and have things make sense. Now, sometimes the objects that we're looking at are curved and complex. So it's kind of difficult to have a grid on something. But we do have grids on curved surfaces. We have coordinates on the surface of the Earth. If you have the exact location in degrees of longitude and latitude, you can find any point on the surface of the Earth, anywhere. This is the same kind of idea. I'm creating a map that makes the most amount of sense to the broadest number of people to reduce ambiguity, to increase understanding. Where am I on the surface? Make sense? And maps tell you where you are. UV mapping, it's telling you where you are. It's the same kind of idea. Now, it gets tricky when you're talking about complex curved surfaces because you can't put a globe in your pocket, right? That's not going to work really. And the downside of a globe is you can only see part of it at a time. You have to rotate it to see other aspects of it. It's not very convenient. So if I want to see the entire surface at one time, I have to change the way it's laid out. You've probably seen a map like this before, right? This is a map where you can see the entire planet. If you look at what we're seeing there, the shell, it looks like it might fold up a little bit and you can kind of see the round thing it would make if you attached it at these seam points. Seams, like the seams on your clothing, right? Things that have seams. Does that make sense? Okay, so what's nice about this is everything's laid out flat. I can see the whole thing. I still have coordinates so I can find specific locations because maps have to do two things. Number one, they have to be understood, right? Mutually understood by the largest number of possible people or entities. But two, what's critically important about maps is they have to be accurate. Accuracy is everything on a map. If it's not accurate, you can get lost. Does that make sense? So UV mapping, same kind of two ideas. I want to have the largest amount of understanding between entities, and I want extreme accuracy with the description and position of points on the surface of any object. Does that make sense? Okay, something quick though I want to point out while we're looking at this slide. Do you notice that in order to represent a complex curved surface flat, I had to kind of put some cuts in it in various locations to unfold it so that it was flat? Does that make sense? It's kind of like if you have a cardboard box. If you cut the corners, the whole thing lays out flat. Does that make sense? Okay, so this is what the Earth in theory would look like if it was laid out flat. Do you think it's a coincidence that the seams on this planet were placed over the water? Do you think it's a coincidence? Why do you think they put the seams over the water? What would make them do that?
It's because you don't want the seams over the continents.
That's correct. That's correct, absolutely. Because this is a map that really centers on or is focused on or what is relatively important, the land masses.
Because
So it's
because also the seams are there. It won't be much because when the seams are through the ocean.
they're through the water, right? And the water's just blue. So it really doesn't make a difference if I put a seam there. Same idea holds true with clothing. Are the seams on my clothing in a random location? No, they're in places where they are less likely to be seen. The seam is up here on my shoulder where you can't see it. The seam is under my arm where you can't see it. The seam is on the sides of your pants, not the front. Does that make sense? The seam could be in other locations, but we try to hide seams. Case in point, if this map depicted the entire Earth and we were looking at the topology of the surface or of the beneath the surface of the water, we're looking at the ground underneath the water, under the sea. And that was what was important. Perhaps we were going to go drilling for oil. What else do we do, right? So point being, I'm not going to put the seams over the water at that point. I'll put it through the land masses because I'm really concentrating on the topology of the sea floor, not necessarily the land masses. Does that make sense? I'm making sure that my map is being very clear, explaining what I want to do very accurately, but I'm bearing in mind specifically what I need that map to do to decide where seams are okay to have and not have. Does that make sense? Just some thoughts on seams. There are going to be seams, but the question is where do we put them? Because that's important. Okay. So UV mapping, what we're doing is we're taking complex curved objects and we're laying them out flat. Because when they're flat like this, we can literally paint right on them. So if you look at this character here, you see there's my face down there. Based on the coordinates of this surface, they match up with the coordinates of the shell that explain where things go. Does that make sense? This is like the Earth laid out flat. It represents this surface, but it helps with the placement of texture because both myself and Maya understand that this point right here is that point right there. Does that make sense? Get a hell yeah? How we doing, my digital friends? We on board? Yeah, UV mapping is a mouthful. There's a lot to get in because it's not like modeling. Okay, good. It is very different than modeling. That's what usually throws people. They're like, it's class number 8. I got this modeling thing down. Yep. Curveball. Yep. So lay it out flat. That's what we're trying to do. Take a complex curved surface and lay it out flat. Now, vocabulary thing, UV shell. When I take a complex curved surface and I lay it out flat, I'm doing that in a special window in Maya called the UV editor. The UV editor is the window in Maya where I look at UV layout. Kind of like the Hypershade is where I look at materials, kind of like the Hypergraph hierarchy is where I can look at nodes and how they connect to each other. The UV editor is where I see my UV shells. And each one of these is a UV shell. And you'll notice they all have seams. And just like when it comes to clothing, just like when it comes to our map of the Earth, it's about putting that seam somewhere inconspicuous because there's going to be seams. And it's possible to fix it. There are tools that will help you fix and hide seams. But you always want to assume that the tool is not going to work. And you want to hide it as best you are able. So that if it doesn't work, no big deal. If it does work, awesome, bonus. Does that make sense? Okay. So, UV shells. Now, back to the accuracy thing. How do I determine accuracy? Because I get the mutual understanding thing. That makes perfect sense. A point on this flat map equals a point on this real object. Now, accuracy. How do I determine accuracy? Well, on the surface of the Earth or anything else, we can just sort of measure stuff. We can figure out how accurate it is. We check the numbers against devices that measure for us, right? And we see those guys out there, the architecture guys with those crazy mirrored things on stilts. But point being, how do we determine the accuracy of a UV shell layout? We use a test pattern. We use a test texture. And that test texture is composed of squares, a nice checker pattern. Because squares are easy to see if there's any distortion. Because squares, again, I hate this word, but they're perfect. So if there's an anomaly, you're going to see it. So what we do is we apply a checker pattern to our geometry, and that tells us how well our UV shells are laid out. So for example, if you take a look here, you can see on the chest of my character, all the squares look like crisp little squares, right? Happy squares, good layout. When I look over here at my shoulder, you can see there's a little bit of distortion going on there. There's a little bit of warping, all right? That tells me that that area is not perfect in terms of its layout. Does that make sense? The checkers tell us where the problems are. Also, something very important to note, do you see how the checkers are all the same size? My Lego guy, you guys know Legos, they're made of many different pieces. I think that's the definition of Lego, in fact. No, it's not. But Legos are made of many pieces, but you will notice that the checker pattern on all of my pieces are the same size. That means that my UV shells are all the same resolution. They are the correct proportion relative to each other. We're going to talk more about that. But note that squares are the same size on the same object everywhere. Make sense? Okay, so that's how we test what's wrong, by applying a checker pattern. Now, let's take a quick look at some of these ideas we've been talking about. All right. Now I'm going to hide my grid just to make it a little bit easier to talk about what I want to talk about. Now, on our polygon object, we have been working with components before, right? We got vertices, we've got faces, we've got edges. There's all kinds of different components. Well, here's a component we haven't talked about before, the UV. When I go to UV mode on my model, you'll notice it's still light blue, indicating component, but I've got these like brownish dots, and they are where you would imagine the vertices would be, right? The vertices used to be there. The difference between a UV and a vertice is a pretty serious one. A vertice is a point in space that defines shape. If you move the vertice, you change the shape of the object. UVs are points in space that explain, describe, and tell you where you are on the surface, like a road map, like a map you would find in a mall. Where am I on this surface? That's what UVs do. They report shape. Does that make sense? One changes the shape, the other reports the shape. Now, in terms of your UVs, you can grab them just like you can grab UVs, right? Select the ones you want. Make sense? But you'll notice that when you go to like tools of manipulation, you can't move them because they just report the surface. You can't move the UVs there. Now, in terms of UVs, UV shells, and UV layout, I told you there's a special window that we go to see the UV layout called the UV editor. Now, if you want to open up the UV editor, all you have to do is go to UV and choose UV editor. It's right there at the top. All right. Now, this window, it's kind of crazy looking. It's kind of intimidating, really, because what it is a massive grid. And your grid may be a different size or what have you. Don't panic. They're all doing the same thing. But in terms of UV space, or let's talk first about the window. There are tools in here, menu items, just like other windows in Maya. They do all kinds of fun stuff. There's buttons. In terms of this area here, the area that we are most concerned with is this first cube, this first square right here on the right-hand side. This is what we call the 0 to 1 space. 0 at the origin and 1 at the perimeter. Now you might be wondering, well, why 0 to 1? Why isn't it 0 to 1,000? Well, between 0 and 1, there are infinite numbers, right? Half, quarter, eighth, 16th, 32nd, 64th. There's always a smaller number. So really, this represents infinite space, 0 to 1. Arbitrary values. I can say that this is 1 mile by 1 mile. That's my call, how big this area is. Does that make sense? Okay. This 0 to 1 space here is the default area where Maya goes to find diffuse color information, texture information to apply to polygon geometry. That's the default location that it goes to find it. Make sense? So if I want specific colors in specific places, it's going to look right in here. Now, you'll notice when I open it up, there's nothing in there. That's because I haven't selected my geometry. UVs are geometry specific. So I have to select the piece of geometry if I want to see its UV layout. So let's do that. When I select the geometry, I see its UV layout. Now, based on what we're looking at, all right, we haven't talked about UVs for very long. How is it you suspect, you don't know for sure, but you suspect that this UV layout, this shell, does not accurately show this surface? Why do you think that is? You guys have any guesses? Anybody? There's no wrong answers. Try me.
They had to make the sphere flat so we can see the entire shape.
Exactly. That's the idea. We want to make sure it's laid out flat, like that map of the Earth that we saw. But when you look at that, does that look like if you connected the sides together, it would make a sphere? No. So right off the bat, it doesn't look like it would make a sphere. So that's definitely I'm not so sure that's accurate, right? There's one other little hint. Just looking at it, you know it can't be right. Can't be. Any guesses? Oh, look at the shape of the squares. Right, Mickey. What shape are all of these things? All the same size and all square. Each one of these represents a face over there. Is that a square? That? No. That can't be accurate. It's not possible because that object has rectangles on it. This is showing it as squares. If I'm trying to fit a square of information into a rectangle, what am I going to have to do? I got to make it fit because it's not big enough. And if I stretch it, is that going to alter the way it looks? Like a logo on a t-shirt. You stretch it, it's not going to look the same. Distortion, inaccuracy. Does that make sense? That's the problem. Now, the good news is we don't have to just look at the shell and determine good or bad. Thank goodness. Because sometimes when you're looking at an object, you don't know. You're looking at 10,000 polygon dragon, you have no idea if the layout is good or bad. But I told you we have a way of figuring that out, right? How do we figure that out? You guys remember? How do we figure out the accuracy with which our shells are laid out? The checker pattern, right? We have this test material that we can apply to this object, and it will tell us if our layout's good or not. If we see happy squares, good. If we don't see happy squares, bad. Make sense? Okay. So accuracy, we suspect maybe not, with good reason. The other thing, mutual understanding. Where is this point over there? Do you know where that is? No idea whatsoever, right? I'm going to have to guess. But what I could do is just go to UV mode here, select a UV. Oh, there it is right there. So, mutual understanding? No. Accuracy? Well, not very likely. We're going to test it, but I don't think so. Does that make sense? Bad UV layout is my suspect. Make sense? Okay. These are the steps for testing the accuracy of your UV shell layout. We're going to apply that test material, and this is how it goes. Step 1, create a new material. We know how to do this because we did that last class, or a class before. Create a new material. What window do I create materials in? In the create window, housed within the Hypershade. That's right, the Hypershade. So first we go to the Hypershade and we make a new material in the create section. And we work with Lambert, so I'm going to make a new one of those. All right, and you'll notice I get the heck out of the Hypershade after that. The Hypershade, in my opinion, is very good for seeing the materials we've created, creating new materials, that kind of thing. It starts getting dodgy with some of those other windows. In fact, it is prone to crashing with some of those other windows. So I create the new material, and then I go to the main interface of Maya, and I'm going to open the attribute editor. Because what I want to do is name this material. We name as we go. This is going to be my checker material. As soon as my fingers start getting cold, my typing gets really bad. So I've got my checker material, right? Now we talked about these many cool attributes of a material. The first material, or the thing that we were messing with 2 classes ago was the color, right? If we wanted to change the color of the material, we would go to the color channel, click on it, find the color we wanted, right? and we would change the material to whatever color we wanted, right? That would change it. But we're not just adding color. We want to attach a texture to this material. So we're going to use the same attribute. We're still going to use color, but we're not going to assign it here. We're going to go to the end of the color channel. Step 2, attach the texture. So what we do is we go to this little checker box at the end of the color channel. I'd like you to think of those checker boxes like ports on a power strip, right? You've got a power strip, you can plug a whole bunch of different things into it, and you can run several pieces of electrical equipment, right? So these little checker boxes are a means of connecting things to each other, and that's what we want to do. So what we're going to do is click on the little checker box. This will open up the Create Render Node window. Does that make sense? Now, within the Create Render Node window, you'll see there's a whole bunch of really fun nodes in here. We're looking at number 2, built right in checker. That's what we want. This is a procedural texture. Procedural meaning it's built into Maya. All copies of Maya have it. So I click on the checker, the node for the checker, and you'll see it creates one. Little piece of advice. When you look at your UVs, what color is the shell? It's white, right? Yeah, the background is gray, but the shell itself is white. So here's the thing. When you make a material, it's going to make your checker pattern black and white. I recommend coloring the white color, something else, so that the shell will stand out against it. Does that make sense? White on white is difficult to see. So what I'm going to do is click on this little white area here and just assign a different color. So it's black and purple, black and green. Knock yourself out, whatever colors you want. Okay? Now, I've got this checker pattern plugged in. Step 3, assign the material. How do I assign material to an object? How do I assign it? Middle mouse button drag is one of the many ways. I can also select the object, hover my cursor over the material, hold down the right mouse button, assign to selection. There's a ton of different ways to get it on there. Those are 2 of them. But now this object is made of that material. I can't see it though, for a very important reason. What's the key for wireframe? 4. What's the key for shaded mode? Guess what the key for texture mode is? 6. If you press 6, you see your geometry with an approximation of what the texture looks like on it. So if you don't press 6, you don't see the texture. Does that make sense? Okay, now, if I look at this applied texture, and let's look at it in the UV editor too, you can see that the texture I've applied is perfect little squares, purple and black. But when I look at my object, do I see perfect little squares? No, I see distorted rectangles, and that tells me bad layout. Does that make sense? We suspected that when we first looked at it. This confirms it. Layout is bad. Does that make sense? Hell yeah? Okay. Now, we can look at the top and the bottom of this thing and see how bad it really is. If you look up here, that's a cool design, but that's definitely not happy little squares. Does that make sense? Clearly bad layout. Any question about that idea at all? No? How about my digital friends, Brian? I hear you clicking away like mad.
Yeah, nothing about a specific turn-in.
Oh, okay. No worries. I just want to make sure we're hitting everything we need to hit.
No questions there.
That's excellent. All right, so this is how we test to determine the accuracy of our layout. This is the giveaway. This lets us know this object has to be UV mapped. I have to remap it. What I'm working with is no good. Does that make sense? Hell yeah? Okay, good. So now we go into the next concept, actual UV mapping. How do I create UV shells? Does that make sense? Now I'm going to do the work. I figured out it's no good. Now what do I do? Incidentally, in terms of moving UVs, something I want to touch on, you go to UV mode within the UV editor, and you can grab the shell, and then you can use your tools of manipulation. You can move it, you can rotate it, you can scale it. Does that make sense? Tools of manipulation work just like that. Make sense? Okay. Also very important to note about manipulation of UVs. If you grab some of your UVs and move them, do you see how that works? Every point can be moved separately. And the problem is, if you move them, look at what's happening to my sphere. Does that look like I'm doing good things to my texture? No. Just be very aware of how UVs and UV shells move. Does that make sense? When you move the whole thing, it doesn't damage it. When you move parts of it, you can cause catastrophes. Make sense? Okay. Point being, be careful. All right. So you are so pushy, Maya. All right. UV mapping. We are going to learn two tools to help us with this UV mapping process, the reorganization of UVs to create a better understanding of where we are on the surface between yourself and Maya, and a higher level of accuracy. So we got two tools we're going to be working with, the planar mapping tool and the cylindrical mapping tool. First, we're going to talk about the planar mapping tool. Now, in terms of UV mapping, basically what we're trying to do is take a complex curved surface and lay it out flat, right? Just like we did with that map of the Earth, lay it out flat. We take 3D and turn it into 2D all the time when we take pictures. When you take a picture, you are taking a 3D universe or construct, depending on whether or not the matrix is real. We are taking a 3D idea and we're turning it into a 2D that you can hang on your refrigerator. Does that make sense? Okay. UV mapping with the planar mapping tool is very similar to that idea. It's like taking pictures. We use the planar mapping tool to take pictures of the surface because it will give us a very accurate idea of where things are placed. Very important to note, if I take a picture of the front of my face, I can very easily measure how far apart my eyes are. And it will be accurate because I took a picture. Does that make sense? If I take a picture from the side of my head, will that make it easy for me to figure out the distance between my eyes? No, it's going to be harder, right? Because from the side, that's not going to help. So if I want to measure the distance between my eyes, I have to take the picture from the right direction. Does that make sense? The direction in which you take that picture is important. Planar mapping tool is just that. We're taking pictures. Cylindrical mapping tool. The cylindrical mapping tool is basically kind of like a scanner. It scans things, but it scans in a cylindrical pattern. So instead of a flatbed scanner that you would put paper on, it's more like an MRI. How many of you guys have ever had an MRI before? They're scary things. Scary, scary. I've had a couple of them. They're not any fun at all. But basically what they do is they put you onto this rolling bed, you know, in a really drafty hospital gown. Very unflattering, no nice colors. And then what they do is they roll you into this tube. You feel like you're being loaded like a torpedo, right? Get him in there. And you're in this little tiny space and they talk to you through an intercom. How's it going in there? You're like, this is great. I'm dead. So it's not any fun at all. But basically what happens is you're laying down inside of this tube and they are scanning around you using this super powerful magnet. And that's why they take all your stuff away, because if you've got anything metal, it's coming right off. Because these magnets are so strong, what they're doing is they're pulling on the molecules of your being and then letting go. And the machine measures how much those molecules move, and it generates a 2D image from your body that it scanned. Very creepy, but better than being cut open, I will say. Not that I've had both, but I would assume. Does that make sense? It's a scanner that scans in a cylindrical pattern. So things that are cylindrical in shape, likely the things you would use that tool on. Does that make sense? Very important. Which way does the scanner scan? Yeah, around like this, right? If I'm laying down, I have to scan in this direction. Does that make sense? If I'm standing up, can I scan like this? I got to go around this way, right? Because I'm cylindrical in this direction. Does that make sense? Making sure the tool is facing the right way. Very important. But that's the cylindrical mapping tool. Make sense? So hooray, there's only two we have to worry about. Let's take a look at these guys. On the left is the planar mapping tool. On the right is the cylindrical mapping tool. The planar mapping tool, it basically looks like a transparent grid. It's got these cubes, these little colored cubes on there that allow you to manipulate the size and shape of the picture you're taking. You can also click on this little red T in the corner, and that will give you the ability to rotate that thing. So you can take pictures at angles too if you want to. Tilt it. Planar mapping tool is for objects that are largely planar or flat in design, but you can use them on anything. Cylindrical mapping tool looks similar to the planar mapping tool, except that it's curved because it scans in a cylindrical pattern. Okay. Again, it's got these cubes, these colored cubes for manipulation of the size and shape of the cylinder. Again, you'll notice this cylinder is standing up, so the scanner is standing up too. But if you need to change the axis that you're scanning on, it has that little red T also that you can click on and then change how that tool is set up to match the axis that the object is on. Does that make sense? Hell yeah? Okay, how about my digital friends? We still on board? Awesome. All right. So we got some mapping ideas going on. It's time to get dirty. That's right. Not what you're thinking, Brian. Although I like where you're going with it. All right. In terms of UV mapping, we have an exercise, of course. It's always super fun to have an exercise. So what we're going to do is, first we're going to create materials and assign them, and then we're going to use the two UV mapping tools that we have learned so far. Does that make sense? Okay, so I want to make sure everybody can do this, because guess what? You're going to have to do this. So we are going to be mapping very simple objects, but I promise you the stuff you will be mapping 3/4 of the way through this class will not be simple objects. You'll be UV mapping more complex objects. You will be UV mapping the stuff you built, which is also a terrific teacher in why do we bother having good geometry? Because poor geometry makes it much harder to UV map. Make sense? Okay, so we've got a little exercise to do. I want to make sure you understand what's going on and how to make it work, because you will be UV mapping and you need to do this stuff as well. And like I said, this is going to be easy compared to the other things you will be mapping. So we got to get down the basics first, and then we will delve into more complicated stuff.
Jasmine says hell yeah.
Hell yeah, I like Jasmine already. Not just because she has a cool name, but an awesome attitude. All right, so we are doing an activity, so we're going to set our project to our activity file folder. activity file, and we are going to file open scene, and we are going to open up our UV mapping activity. All right. Now, incidentally, in terms of this activity we're doing, when you've done it and you're happy with how it turned out, make sure you save this file because we're going to need it when we get together again on Friday. Does that make sense? We're going to play with it some more, so make sure you hang on to it at the end of today. And if you do it in the lab, make sure at the end of lab, save it there too. All right. So I've got 3 pieces of geometry, a plane, a cube, and a cylinder. And I need to determine how good their UV layout is, right? First, we determine if it's good or bad, and then we use our tools on them to fix them. So the first step to determining the quality and accuracy of the layout of our UVs is we're going to open up a special window. What window is that? UV editor, absolutely. So we open up the UV editor, and I've squished my copy of Maya down so you can't see my UV menu set. Oh, come on, how much further over is it? There it is. Open up my UV editor, right? And I don't see anything in there. ¿Qué pasó? Huh? I gotta select the object. So first we're gonna look at the first object, the geometry plane. I select it. That's what Maya thinks its UV layout looks like. Right off the cuff, what do you think? Good or bad? What do you guys think? Hands up. How many of you think that's good UV layout? How many of you think that's bad UV layout? That's definitely bad. I know you're probably hoping it was good so we wouldn't have to do anything, but not this time. We have to fix it. And again, the key is fix it. We're not breaking it, we're not deleting it, we're not losing it. We're just rearranging it so that it's better. Does that make sense? UVs are rearranged, not lost for all eternity. Make sense? Okay. So we're looking at the UVs. I can see, yeah, that doesn't look right, but we need to do a test to make sure. What's our test? What do we do? We apply the checker pattern. Who can tell me the steps for the application of the checker pattern to determine the accuracy of our UV layout? Go to the Hypershade window, rendering editors Hypershade. I open that window up. Net, what's 2? First, create a new material. Yep, make a Lambert. And again, I make my adjustments in the attribute editor in the main interface. I actually had a student on the phone just today who was like, oh my goodness, every time I click on something in the Hypershade, there's a window in there called the property editor, which looks a whole boatload like the attribute editor. This thing is the devil. And I don't say that about a lot of things. I used to say it more often. This is definitely the devil. Please do not use the property editor. There are enough copies of Maya out there where it causes it to crash instantly that I'm just saying avoid it. You can do the same thing in the attribute editor. That little button right there that looks like 3 screwdrivers on top of each other, right? So use that one. So here I am in the attribute editor. I've got this new material, which I'm going to name my checker material.
It says change the color.
Yes, and change the color. So what's the next step?
Select the checker box.
Go to the checker box of the color attribute. You'll notice that quite a few of the attributes have checker boxes. That's for plugging other things in there. You know, it's like Christmas lights. But we're dealing with color. We go to the checker box at the end and we click it. And that opens up the create render node. So now we click on which node? The checker one. I'm not trying to trick you. So we go to the checker one. And again, I switch the white color to something else just to make it easier to see. And then the next step is what? Apply it. Apply the material to the object in one of the many ways I've shown you. But I don't see it. Why do I not see the checker pattern on there? I got to press 6 to see the checkers.
Perfect.
Do I see checkers? Nope. Nope.
You did something wrong, Steve.
I definitely did something perfectly right. But what that does is it confirms what my UV editor was kind of telling me when I looked at my UV layout, is that the UV layout is very, very bad. Does that make sense? And I have to be honest, I made it worse than it was. It didn't really by default come out that bad. I made it worse just to make it blatantly obvious that it was poor. Does that make sense? All right. So now we know we have to rearrange the UVs. We have to map this. So here are the steps for using the planar mapping tool. That's right. Steps means right. I should have like a blinking sign that says, write this stuff down. Of course, it would be on most of the time. But here we go. Step 1, select the face or faces you wish to map. You can map the whole object at once. When you get better at this, you can do that. But typically, we as beginners, we start with just a few at a time because it's less overwhelming. But you will get better at it. It gets easier. And the good news is UV mapping is very repetitive. So once you get it down, you're good. But if you're missing a step, you're dead in the water. And that's why I say you got to have them. So step 1, select the face or faces you wish to map. The good news is I've only got one face on this polygon plane. It could be 90, it doesn't make any difference, but I've only got one face, so I select it. Step 2, determine the axis that you wish to take the picture on. All right, I like to use my move tool because it comes with axes built right in, and I can see them easily. Now, if I want to get a really nice picture of the top of this piece of polygon geometry, what axis do you think I would want to take the picture in? What do you think? I got some Y's. I got some Z's. There's only one more to choose from. I'll choose X if nobody does. So we got X, Y, Z. What do we choose? Well, if I want to get a nice picture of this face, never when I want one. Typical. All right. If I want to get a nice picture of that face, if I take a picture in Z, this is what I'm looking at. Does that show me what that surface looks like? No. Here's me looking in X. All right. Let me get through my geometry there. That's X. Do I have a good look at what this thing looks like from X? No. Let's try Y. This is the Y-axis. Does that give me a good look at what this geometry looks like? Absolutely. So this is the axis I want, Y. So now that I've determined what axis I want to take the picture on, the next step, I go to my UV menu set and I find my planar mapping tool and I go to the options box. Guess why I have to go to the options box? Because I'm going to do something, absolutely. I go to my options box because I have to tell it what axis to take the picture on. Does that make sense? It doesn't know. So I have to choose Y. Make sense? Okay. Then I hit apply. Boop. Do I now see happy squares? Okay. Now, as I promised, this planar mapping tool, which is floating ever so slightly above the geometry, I can change its shape and size by grabbing these color-coded cubes on here. Does that make sense? And I can click the little red T, which will give me what looks like the extrude tool. But if I select the little circle on the outside, I have the ability to angle my planar mapping tool. So if my geometry is at an angle, I can angle my camera also. Make sense? Okay. Now, when I created this much better looking UV layout, look what happened in the UV editor. I created what we call a UV shell. Now, what I do next after I determine the correct axis to take the picture on is I drag my UV shell out of the 0 to 1 space out into the work area. Okay? Now, the reason I do that is because as you're mapping, you continually create new shells. If you don't drag them out of the 0 to 1, they will all be piled up on top of each other. And it gets messy and confusing. Does that make sense? So again, as a beginner, I recommend very highly, make a shell, drag it out. Make a shell, drag it out. When there are no more pieces of UV inside the 0 to 1, then you've mapped that object. It's done. Does that make sense? Okay. So this shell is done. My UV layout looks good because I see happy squares. There's no more white lines in here, so I must have mapped the entire object. Make sense? Okay. Now, once I've mapped my object, I'm going to bring my UV shell back into my 0 to 1. Can I grab just one UV to move this shell? If I move just one UV, look what happens to my texture. Right? Looks cool unless it's your texture. Does that make sense? I don't move one. I'm going to grab everybody and move them into the 0 to 1 space. Yes?
Does it have to be exactly, it is there?
That is an excellent question. Yes, it must. I don't want even one UV hanging outside of there. Got to get it in there for this class, for what we're trying to do. Does that make sense? In different instances, there are sort of different rules. We need everything to be in there. Does that make sense? Okay, very important to notice about UV shells. Gesundheit. When I make my shell bigger, what happens to my squares? If I make my squares smaller, they get bigger. All right? What we're talking about there with shell size is resolution. What's the resolution of my image? High resolution or low resolution? Does that make sense? While we're right here, I want to talk about this. Not you, not you, you. You guys are so pushy. This is a low resolution image. Images are made of pixels, little tiny squares. They come together to make digital art, design, visual information. In this case, it's an oil barrel. This is a low resolution image. You could probably guess that, but you would know as soon as you started zooming in. You start to see the squares, the pixels that make the design, because the design is made of pixels. Does that make sense? Not many pixels. You see the squares quickly and easily. You don't have to get very close, and it looks what we call jaggy, right? I can see the squares, the pixels that make that drawing. It's like pointillism, if you've seen the art. Now, let's take a look at another image. This is also an oil barrel. This is a high resolution image. Watch as I get closer to it, and I still don't see the pixels. Eventually I can see them. They're the pixels, but they're very small. Does that make sense? If you take a low resolution image and make it too big, it gets jaggy and pixely. A high resolution image you can make bigger and it will still hold on. Does that make sense? That's resolution. How many little pixels are in this picture, however big the picture is? More pixels, higher resolution, better quality image. Does that make sense? Think of pixels like jelly beans. Pixels are the smallest unit. I can't make anything smaller than a pixel, just like jelly beans are more or less the same size. More jelly beans, high resolution. Fewer jelly beans, low resolution. So we take these jelly beans and we put them into jars. Now, if I can't make jelly beans any bigger or smaller, if I want to increase the number of jelly beans, what can I do? Bigger jar, right? If I have a bigger jar, I can get more jelly beans in there. Make sense? Bigger image, more pixels. Resolution. When my UV shell is big, I can get more jelly beans in it. When my UV shell is small, I get fewer jelly beans in it. Jelly beans don't change size, but I can change the container. Does that make sense? Okay. So here we are. Bigger container, more jelly beans. Make sense? Okay. So that's my first UV shell. It's in place. Time to do the next piece of geometry. This is going to get harder. Again, when you look at its UV layout in the UV editor, you can surmise it's probably poor, right? If you took this cube and laid it out flat, you do not imagine it would look like this. But we can check it by doing what? Apply the checker pattern. Good news is once we've made a checker pattern, we can put it on everything in our scene if we want. Drag and drop it. It is confirmed. It is boo-how. Boo-how. Time to fix it. Right? This object is composed of mostly flat surfaces. Guess which tool we're probably going to use? Planar mapping tool. Make sense? So let's get busy. Step 1, select the face or faces you wish to map. Step 2, determine the axis in which you would like to take the picture. If I want to take a picture of this face, what axis should I be on? What do you guys think? Y. How about my digital buddies? Where are you guys? We got a Y vote. We got some Z votes. We definitely want to do it in Y because, again, if we want to get a nice picture of this face right here, we take that in Y. I'll show you why it's not Z. Can I see that face in Z? No, it's paper thin, so that's not going to work. Does that make sense? It's got to be Y. Now, the good news is, I'll show you what happens when you choose the wrong axis. UV, planar mapping tool, options. I'm going to choose Z. When I project, boop, do I see happy squares? No, I picked the wrong axis. Does that make sense? It's obvious when you choose the wrong one. If you don't see happy squares, you did something incorrectly. So I choose Y. I get a nice picture of the top. I get nice happy squares. And in so doing, I've created a UV shell. So I go to my editor and I drag that shell outside of the 0 to 1. There's still some stuff in here. Guess what that needs to be done to it? More mapping. I got to clean it up, right? That tells me there's more to do. That's why I drag the shells out so they don't pile up on top of each other. All right, let's do this face right here. Which axis do I want to take this picture on if I want to get a nice picture of the front of this cube? Z. Does that make sense? I'm looking right down the Z axis. That's the axis I want to take the picture on. So, again, UV, planar mapping tool. I choose the Z axis, take a picture. I get a nice little checker pattern here. I know I'm doing a good job. I drag it out of the 0 to 1, put it over there. Let's do this guy. All right. If I want to get a nice picture of that side of the cube, what axis is that? Oh, some dissension. How many of you think Y? How many of you think X? How many of you think Z? Just me, okay. Those of you who said X, you're correct. It is the X axis because we're looking at the side of the cube. Again, if I want a picture of this face, I got to take the picture on that angle. This is going to be directly on, that's directly above. I won't see that flat. Again, the idea is if I'm trying to take pictures of the front of my face to determine how far apart my eyes are, if I take the picture from the back, that's not going to help me, right? Picture of the back of my head will only tell you the width of my head, with assumptions of thickness. All right, so here we go. I select the face or faces I wish to map, UV, planar map, and I choose the X axis. Take a picture. More happy squares. I've still got some stuff in here. I've got more mapping to do. Let's do this guy. Now here's where it gets a little trickier. What axis do I want to take the picture on for this face? Still X. It is still X. You might think negative X because we're on the negative side of it, but there's not a negative X option. When you go into the tool, X is what you're looking at. UV, planar, there is no negative option, so you just got to leave it at X. So I leave it at X, I hit apply, I get a nice picture, drag it out. Time to get this guy. What axis is this one on? Z for that one, absolutely, because you want to be shooting right down that axis to get a nice picture. UV planar. I choose the Z axis, take a picture, I get a nice photo. Again, as I said, thank goodness it's repetitive. It's obnoxious, but if you figure it out, you can do it. It's when you don't have the instructions that this is just short of a living hell. All right. So, last face. What axis do I take this picture on? Y axis, from above. UV, planar, Y. And incidentally, if you're feeling like, man, I guessed wrong every time, don't worry, you will get the hang of this. It just takes some time, but pretty soon you will know exactly what you're supposed to be doing. All right, so I've mapped this object. Something very important to note about the mapping. Do you see how every side of this thing, the squares are the same size? That's because each one of these shells is the correct size and proportion relative to each other. That's why the square is the same size. So for example, if I grab the face on top, this one right here, if I make it smaller than everyone else, do you guys see how the squares are a different size? Because this is out of proportion compared to that. If I make it too big, the opposite but similar problem. They are not the correct proportion relative to each other. If I took a cardboard cube and cut it into each individual face, each face should be the same size. The definition of a cube is a series of squares that come together to form it, and they're all the same size. Does that make sense? Okay. So these need to be the same size. Now, once I've got all of these cubes, again, for our class, what we're going to do is get all of these cubes back into this area, the 0 to 1 space. So what I'm going to do is grab everybody and scale them all and put them back in there together. Gesundheit. So that they fit neatly inside. Make sense? Everything fits inside the 0 to 1. Not even one UV hanging out because of what we're going to do with it. One last thing, and I'm coming back to your question. Do you see how the squares of these two objects are different sizes? The plane and the cube have different size cubes. That's okay. They're different objects. Does that make sense? On the same object, no matter how many pieces it's made of, the squares are the same size. On different objects, they can have different size squares. That's fine for what we're doing. Does that make sense? Get a hell yeah? Okay. How about my digital friends? We okay? Excellent. What was your question? You good? You got it? Yes, no? You got it? Are you okay?
Oh yeah, sorry.
Yeah, that's fine.
I forgot. Do the cubes have to match a symmetrical pattern with the other faces, with all the faces? Like,
When the cubes are all the same size and shape, they do match.
gotcha.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
Then it's correct. If your squares are of different sizes, something's wrong. You are not representing those shapes, those faces relative to the real one and each other correctly. That's your guide. Yeah. Oh, not yet. But flow into each other is an interesting question. Do they need to flow into each other? Maybe. It depends on the texture. Because at the edge of each one of these shells is a what? A seam. So what you have to ask yourself is, what's the texture I'm putting on this object? Does it have to be continuous? Do they need to flow into each other? Again, what do I need this thing to do? Answers that question. We haven't seen the texture yet, so we have no idea. But that's an important question. What do I need this thing to do? Should they connect to each other or not? Maybe. It depends on what it is. Does that make sense? If that cube is a crate, right? Who hasn't played a video game where you got to blow up a crate to get like something, right? If you've got a crate, it doesn't necessarily have to flow into each other because each side is wood and it's nailed together. Does that make sense? That would indicate not needing to flow into each other. But let's say that this is like a coal car from a mining cave, right? Where they're going to get copper or gold or silver. If that's a mining car and it's made from a single piece of metal, and I've got some scratches or some dings or some details that go from the side onto the front, maybe the name of the mine wraps around. Do they need to flow into each other? Yeah, they do. Does that make sense? Again, what do you need it to do dictates should they be connected or not. We're going to talk more about that day too, but I'm glad you're thinking about it already. That's awesome. All right. Any questions on the cube? Because I'm going for broke. We're doing the cylinder now. Okay. Here we go. You can't stop me. All right. Step one, we need to confirm that our UV layout is poor. If I select the object, I see the UV layout. What do you think? Good or bad? Pretty good. Another round for that guy. Obviously, this is poor UV layout. But again, we confirm. We create our material and we apply. We go to our hypershade. Again, we've got that checker in there already, so we don't have to create it again, thankfully. We can just drag and drop it, put it on there. And again, it confirms for us that that is horrible in terms of a layout. So obviously we need to fix it. Now, this is where it gets a little bit interesting. First, I'm going to map the sides of this thing, and then I'm going to map the middle. So I'm going to select the faces on the end. Now, based on what I have selected, because you know the tool works by selecting the face or faces you wish to map, right? That's how both of the tools work. We haven't used the cylindrical mapping tool yet, right? But I could be tricking you. I might not be tricking you. I do have short sleeves on, so it's harder for me to pull off magic tricks. But which tool do you think I need to use here? The surface I'm mapping is round. There are many faces, and it's round. What tool do you think I need to use there? It's hard to determine because it's round, so you would think maybe cylindrical, but it's flat. It is a planar. I need to use the planar mapping tool. I'm going to have more success with it because although it is round in shape, it is flat. Therefore, planar mapping tool makes sense. Does that make sense? So I select the face or faces I wish to map. Step 2, determine the axis I want to take the picture on. If I want to take a picture of those faces, what axis do I choose? X. Make sense? Okay. So UV planar mapping tool. I choose the X axis. Oh, let me get in here and change it so where you can actually see it happen. X axis. I take the picture. I get a nice round shell. Doesn't that shell look just like the end of that object? Again, it's about the accuracy at which one depicts the other. All right. And again, when I look at this, I see happy squares, so I know I'm doing the right thing. So now I'm going to come over here and I'm going to get these other guys on the other side. Okay. What axis do I take that picture on? X again, because I want to look right down that axis. If I can see these two, then it's the third one. Does that make sense? That's the giveaway. Look right at the faces. And if I see Y and Z, then it must be X, because that's the one I'm looking down. Okay. So UV, planar mapping. Again, I want the X. I take a picture. I get another fun little wagon wheel. And again, it looks like either end of this object. I mean, if I took a cylinder and cut the ends off, you'd expect it to look like that, right? That makes sense. Yes?
Could you just do both sides of
Ah, excellent question. Could you do them both at the same time? You could, but you would create two separate shells and they'd be right on top of each other. Does that make sense? You might not realize that, and then when you try to move them, you could accidentally distort one and or lose one. Does that make sense? So just for ease, I try to work from simple to complex. So we're going to keep them separate. But could you do that? Of course. All right. I've still got some stuff in my 0 to 1, so I know I've got more mapping to do. The part that I need to map is this part here, the middle, right? And you can see I just sort of marquee selected over everything through the middle. I'm doing this part out here. All right. Now, which tool do you think I would use to map that part? Cylindrical mapping tool. I could also use the planar mapping tool because you can planar map cylinders. To be honest with you, I use the planar mapping tool like 90% of the time, regardless of what I'm mapping. But cylindrical mapping tool is really good for mapping things that are extremely cylindrical in shape. Telephone poles, pipes, arms, torsos, you know, things that are cylindrical. It's pretty good for that. Could you use the planar? Absolutely. But I want to show you the cylindrical mapping tool, so we're going to use that one. So I select the faces that I want to map. Again, that's the same as the planar mapping tool. This time, I go to UV, and right above planar, I choose cylindrical. I take a picture. How did my UV map turn out? Does that look good? When I look into the 0 to 1, if I took a cylinder and cut the ends off and unrolled the middle, would it look like that? Right? No. That looks like, you know, two of those nuclear silos next to each other. There's not one too far from here. Field trip. But the point is, that doesn't look right. I know that's not right. When I look at my layout, that's not right. I did something wrong. What did I did? Anybody know? What? I didn't. I let Maya do it without enough instruction, and I actually did tell you what I did wrong when I explained the tool. Look at my scanner. Is my patient lying down or standing up? My patient is lying down. But look at the way I'm scanning. My patient is lying this way. I'm scanning this way. That's why it looks terrible. That make sense? So how do I adjust the axis I'm scanning on? Well, I could rotate the cylinder actually if I wanted to. You're getting there. Your suggestion would work, but we can't always rotate things to get them exactly like we want them. But you're right, if I change the axis the cylinder was on, that would also work. But what I want you to learn how to do, because not everything is on a perfect axis, you want to match angles and stuff like that. What you want to do is change the axis the tool is scanning on. You guys remember me telling you about that little red T in the corner? If I click on that little red T, it activates the rotate capacity of the tool. I can click the outer circle and then rotate that thing into place so that I'm scanning sideways the same way the object is resting. Okay? And watch what happens to my UVs as I make the adjustment. Look in my editor. Watch as I turn this thing. Watch what happens to my UVs. It is kind of like a slinky. But wouldn't you imagine if I took a cylinder and cut the ends off and laid the middle out flat, wouldn't you expect to see a rectangle? That looks more like what would actually happen. Does that make sense? And that's why it's right. And I can literally plug in a value of 90 because it's a 90-degree rotation to try to get it as dead on as I can. All right. So here's my object, my cylinder. Is it looking good? I got happy squares, but what's wrong with them? The resolution is wrong. The shells relative to each other are not accurately created, right? They're not the same size or the correct size relative to each other because the squares are different sizes. Now, if you look at this object, would you agree it kind of looks like a soup can in shape, right? Roughly a soup can. If I look at my UV shells, here are my shells in the UV editor. If I took this middle part and wrapped it around the outside, standing up, like you would if you were putting it back together again, right? Number one, I'm not entirely certain this would go all the way around. And number two, if it did, it wouldn't be very tall. So I'm not really looking at a soup can. If I put those together, it's more like a tuna fish can. Short and round. Does that make sense? They don't look like the same thing. And that's why my squares are different sizes. Because I can see, the resolution is off. They're not the same size. They're not the relative proportion to each other. So what I have to do is either make both of these guys smaller or this one bigger. Right? Something has to change. So here's what I'll do. I will grab this part, and I grab everybody, you'll notice. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the squares on the end, and I'm going to compare them to the squares on the side. If I make it smaller, nope, that's not the solution. Make it bigger. There we go. I'm comparing this square to that square. That's pretty close. Right there. That looks pretty close. Does that make sense? Now look at the shells I've created. If you were to cut those shapes out, would that make more of a soup can kind of shape? Much taller. If I wrap it around and put those two things together, that would probably make a more soup can-like shape. Again, the proportions of the shells relative to each other are more accurate, and that's why the squares are the same size. They're both telling you the same thing. Visually, I see it here. Confirmation there. That's more the correct proportion. Does that make sense? Get a hell yeah on that? Okay. So now these shells are looking good. Guess where they have to go? Back in the 0 to 1 space. So I'm going to take these two guys, and incidentally, in terms of shells, if you grab just part of a shell and you want to grab the whole shell, a neat trick you can do, hold down the command key, the one right next to the space bar, and the right mouse button, and you'll see 2 UV shell as an option, and that allows you to select a whole shell from a single UV so that you don't move part of it and stretch it and mess it up. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of put these guys near to each other because I know they're going to fit into a square space. So I'm going to try to arrange them into sort of a square-like pattern up here. And I'm going to get them as close together as I can so that when I get them into the 0 to 1, I'm really using the space inside of the 0 to 1 to the best of my ability. I want to make those shells as big as I can. They still have to fit in the 0 to 1, but I want them to use up as much of that space as possible without going over. Because I always want to get the most jelly beans in my jars as I can. The more jelly beans I have in my jar, the happier I am. Unless it's Bean Boozled. That's wrong. Wrong, wrong, wrong. But back to the good jelly beans. The bigger my jar is, the more jelly beans go in there. So when I put my jars into the 0 to 1, I want them to make as big as I can. They have to fit into the 0 to 1. That's the rule. But I want it to be as big as I can while maintaining the squares as all the same size. Does that make sense? So the things I've taught you today, big surprise, that is a good percentage of what we're looking for when you UV map your objects. Number 1, I want to see happy little squares, right? Happy little trees, squares, happy little squares. And those squares need to be the same size. Seams in good locations, smart locations for seams. When I create all my shells, those shells all go into the 0 to 1 neatly, as big as I can make them, but they fit into the 0 to 1. Does that make sense? That's almost half of the requirements that we're looking for grade-wise. You got to do those things. Does that make sense? Because what I told you about and what we are grading on are the things that make good UV layout and therefore good texture application. Does that make sense? Very important. Any questions about what we've done so far? Yes? Yep. In that instance, it was a 90-degree adjustment. It's not guaranteed to be 90. Oh, in the attribute editor? Yeah, I literally just rotated the tool a little bit. I saw which attribute changed from 0 to whatever it became, and I just plugged in 90. I override it. Does that make sense?
I lost track of one part. demonstration, after class, could you show me it again?
Sure, I can. But why don't you ask me, which part did you miss?
When you're trying to fix the cylinder shape, I lost track of how to fix.
Okay, let me show you that one real quick. And the reason I'm going to show you is because first off, you asked very nicely. But second, this particular issue plagues a lot of people. They miss this one a lot. Why do my UVs look so bad? What's wrong? You got to rotate your tool. So we need to rotate our tool to the correct axis, and then it's going to work beautifully. Does that make sense? But the key is knowing how to do it, recognizing the problem for what it is, and then having the correct solution. So watch me and I'll show you, because it is important. Many people get this wrong, and that's why I'm going to do it again. Let's see if I've got enough Z's in here to do it. Yay! All right. So when I first map this, UV, cylindrical mapping tool, boom, I get this horrible shape because my cylinder is lying down. Do you see it lying down? It looks like it's laying on its side. But if you look at my tool, I'm scanning this way. I should be scanning this way. Does that make sense? I need to either change the axis of my object or change the axis of my tool. So I could actually go in here and go whoop and try to turn it that way and do the scan again. But sometimes you can't do that because literally you're scanning something that is on a different axis because you model first and then you UV map. So if you're looking at an object that's built into part of something, you know, a series of pipes in your ductwork or whatever, you can't necessarily rotate the whole room to UV on the correct axis. So we're going to adjust the tool. Does that make sense? But what you suggested would work. So what we're going to do is with these faces selected, actually let me run my tool again. Cylindrical mapping tool, boop. What I'm going to do is I'm going to come down here to the tool and you'll see there's a little red T in the corner. Click on that T and that activates the ability to rotate the tool. And you'll see all of my rotates are at 0. So when I click on that outer circle and it gives me the ability to manipulate, I rotate on the Z axis, I see which one is changing, and I set that one for 90 to move it at a 90-degree rotation from where it was. And now, nailed it. You're welcome. But that's why I do it again. Again, that's something that plagues a lot of people. I know Brian has seen it a million times. You gotta scan it on the correct axis. You can't assume Maya's gonna do everything right, because way more often than not, it doesn't. What's that? If you select the faces and go to UV cylindrical mapping tool, it will show up. It's definitely in there for sure. I'll show you once class is over, but there's no way you don't have the cylindrical mapping tool. That thing is of paramount importance. Does that make sense? All good? Now, how about my digital friends? We on board? Awesome. So in terms of this exercise, if you've got happy little squares and everything's in the 0 to 1, make sure you save this file. If it didn't go great today, that's fine. When you go to lab tonight, do this exercise again, and once it's looking good, save it. Make sure you save it, because we are going to go in, but save it with a different name, because we are going to use this file again on Friday together to add textures to it, which is going to be super fun. You're going to see why we bother to go through this obnoxious process, because when we put textures on stuff, it's way more cool. So this is why we endure it. All right. So make sure you save that when you got it good to go. But we must return to our Slides, because it's time to talk about the skill check. Whoop. Skill check. How do you think I'm going to check how well you understand UV mapping? I'm going to make you UV map something. That's right, because that's the kind of sick monkey I am. So we're going to UV map something. Guess what you're going to map? The jar you built. All right, now you guys are going to UV map your jar. You don't have to make a texture or anything. I just want to see you put checkers on it, just like you see it in this picture here. Does that make sense? That's what you're going to do. This will help you to realize, number one, modeling and the efficiency of which you model actually adds to how easy it is to UV map something. Poor modeling technique yields much more frustrating UV mapping. So you start to see why these things are interdependent. Because who's the modeler who made this? Oh yeah, that was me. So you have nobody to blame. So what I want to see you guys do is UV map the jar you built, and please make sure you're using the one that you modeled, activity 3, not the one you blocked out for activity 2. We don't UV map blocked out stuff, only modeled assets. So make sure we're UV mapping the jar that you modeled for activity 3. All right. Now, just to give you a hint, because I'm that kind of guy, I'm going to show you what all right, here's my jar, and you can see it's been UV mapped, and I'm going to give you a hint on how to approach the generation and placement of your UV shells. All right, in fact, I'm going to drag it out of the 0 to 1 so it's easier to see. Here is my UV shell layout for my jar. What do you think this shell represents? The bottom of my jar. On the inside or the outside? Outside. What's that? The inside. The reason you can tell is because the outside's bigger than the inside. The jar has a relative thickness. Therefore, this is smaller than that. Does that make sense? Okay. Here we are looking at the jar, the UV shell for the body of the jar. Most likely what tool? Cylindrical mapping. Does that make sense? Because it's cylinder. Very important to note, it's got 2 cylinders. There's the outside cylinder and the inside cylinder. Does that make sense? Because there's thickness to this thing. All things have some measure of thickness to them. So the inside and the outside. Now, I haven't shown you how to do this yet, but we're going to connect them. That's what we're going to talk about on Friday. But I want to see you start trying to UV map this thing. So yours will be in 2 pieces, unless you know how to connect them. But I will let you in on a little secret. If you put the edges really, really, really close to each other, it's almost as if they are attached. So you can still make it look like it is. But we're going to talk about how you can actually attach them to each other. But that's a hint on layout for your jar. Make sense? Hell yeah? Okay, cool. So UV map your jar. I just want to see checkers on it. That's totally fine. That is your skill check for lecture, what is this, 8? 8. The ocho. So make sure you got that worked out. As I said, Friday we're going to get together. What time are we getting together on Friday? 9 a.m. Everybody's at 9 a.m. online. Be there or be square, cube, sphere, cylinder, one of them. But you got to be there online, and you got to be there at 9. So please be there. This room, I don't know what's going to be going on in here, but we're not going to be here. We're not even scheduled to be in this room anyway. Yep. Make sense? Okay, so I'll see you guys all digitally on Friday. For my digital friends, it'll be no different for you because all of your lectures are digital, but it will be at a different time. So please take note of that. We'll send out a little reminder message / email thing to tell you, but Friday at 9 a.m., that's when we're getting together. So make sure you're there if you can make it. It's going to help because UVs are a little bit complicated. But the good news is, you guys, I think you did pretty well today. I saw a lot of attentiveness. I saw a lot of good answers. Seems like you were pretty dialed in. The real test will be when you have to do it on your own. So that's when it becomes a whole other thing. Yes?
So lab is still the same hours on Friday?
Same thing for lab. Same hours as it always is. No difference there at all. Just the lecture is earlier. And online for everybody. You guys do. It's always online for you. All righty? Good? Awesome. Good job today. I like the attentiveness. I like the focus. You guys really did terrific. Friday will be much easier as a result. Walking into Friday, if you didn't do well today, it's really hard. So good on you guys. So I'll see you Friday digitally, and we will talk more about these UV shells and how we can improve UV layout and finalize our UV layout for the creation and application of textures, which is why we do all this work. You got a question? Yep, I can come right over there. All right, thank you very much, everybody. I will see you all virtually on Friday. Thank you.